The time preceding the era known as antiquity was one of polyamorous diversity, gender-fluid peace, and harmony throughout the world. Disease did not exist. People helped one another. There was no capitalism and thus no poverty, no starvation, no want. Women played a full part in society, and non-binary people were accepted and treasured for their unique contributions, albeit that no one quite remembers anymore what they actually were. It was a golden age, rich in art and, well, rich in so many things. Social anthropologists have established beyond doubt that this was the time in which the song Kumbaya was written. The early ancient period was still a warm, humane place to be. People of colour in the Middle East, founding inclusive civilizations, safe spaces for minorities of all kinds. Leaders well known for their benevolent and tolerant policies, rulers like mighty Pharaoh and the King of Kings of Mesopotamia, ruled with a gentle touch, embracing their feminine and delicate side. Though even in these lustrous times, evil was already upon us. Depraved tyrants introduced patriarchy, allowing brutish men to crush and destroy gentle yet powerful and strong women with no limits, you understand, for millennia to come. Now throughout the lands the darkness rose. In the west, in a god-forsaken place called Europe, arose a people bent on destruction, all united by their lack of melanin and their irrational hatred of anyone who had any. Evil Greeks creating charades such as ethno-exclusionary scientific approaches and supremacist ideas such as democracy. Next, a male chauvinist by the name of Alexander succeeded on the battlefields of the Middle East solely due to the ruthless exploitation of his white privilege. Vicious Romans arose, man-spreading their way around the Mediterranean with their imposition of law and order, when everyone knows that policing of all kind ought to be defunded, as all law enforcement is racist, except for that which oversees hate speech, of course. The Roman peace shall go down as one of the most hate-filled periods of human existence. Never should we forget that the Romans disbarred women and people with diverse pronouns from joining the legions. But worst of all, a new religion was born, founded by a man, of course, a patriarchal sexist who excluded women from his disciples, which, as anyone who knows anything about the religion today can tell you, is against the will of God, whatever her name is. The situation became ever worse. There were brief respites from the horrors of this oppression, with a rise of diverse, peaceable, tolerant societies such as the Huns and the Mongols, but again and again the tyranny of Europe re-established itself, crushing all underfoot. The medieval period then saw vicious attacks by white Europeans on Muslims in Spain, whose earlier immigration had been largely peaceful, and, worse by far, the Crusades, which sought to overturn by brutality alone the utterly bloodless conquest of the Levant by high-minded, intersectional feminist Muslims from the previous violent, patriarchal, Christian, phallocentric oppressors of the vicious Byzantine culture. Yet at least the rest of the world remained untouched, unblemished by the evils of Europe, its racism, its patriarchy and wicked religion. That is, until the Spaniards sent forth an evil, far-right Italian, known throughout the world as the foremost racist of the age, called Christopher Columbus. In the New World, these evil-minded Spaniards then were to encounter peaceful, kind-hearted people who atop blood-spattered pyramids exchanged knitting patterns and cake recipes. At once noticing that these people had a slightly different complexion than their own, the Spaniards set about killing everything in sight for the next 500 years. The Renaissance saw great female artists like that Italian with, that name, something or other, explore the wonderfully diverse forms of expression of the ancient world, but evil patriarchal menfolk wrote them out of history and instead promoted second-rate has-beens like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Next, the Enlightenment saw the evil of whiteness spread across the globe like never before. Through a wicked process known as invention, the pigment-deprived nations of Europe gained vast technological advantages by which they then went about stealing all the wealth of the earth which the peaceful, feminist, multicultural peoples of the world had heaped up. In a calamitous crime, the British then succeeded in conquering an Indian subcontinent far richer, technologically more advanced, and just better in every way than themselves. It followed the usual pattern in which vastly superior civilizations tend to lose to a bunch of nits on a boat several thousand miles away from home. Among all the grim whiteness of the 18th century, there was at least the well-established fact that the American War of Independence was won by Betsy Ross with the help of Pocahontas. with only minor contribution by toxic menfolk. This was of course before the dreadful United States of America was to turn into the worst place for any woman to live on this earth. But most of all, the 18th century will live in ignominy forever for the cruel, unjust invention of slavery by the British. Fueled by lust for money and a pathological hatred for anyone with darker skin than their own, the British, out of the blue, and with no prior example, set about creating the slave trade and the plantation economy. The result was poor, peaceful black folk being dragged from their climate-controlled, well-plumbed, high-tech abodes by ruthless white invaders bent on plunder and destruction. The only solace from this being that there was no involvement in slavery whatsoever by people of colour. In Europe itself, the greatest military commander of all times, Empress Josephine, bestrode the battlefields like a colossus. Of course, history written by white men, then attributed it all to some pot-bellied Corsican. The Industrial Revolution, a crime committed against nature by white people, saw foremost the British, who were already entirely responsible for the crime of slavery before the women of Wakanda finally put an end to it. Well, anyway, those evil British, they sought a way to create global warming in order to harm the global south and found their wicked solution in mechanized industry powered by coal and petroleum. Likely the most pampered among all the Westerners of the industrial age should be the coal miners, with their comfortable, stable jobs and excessive white privilege. Now, some less educated individuals might say their lives were such of harsh physical labour. But then, what is that when set against the lived experience of a black sociology student in the 21st century, I ask you? Industrial fumes having driven the nations of Europe all but insane, they set about colonising the virginal, innocent continent of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa in particular being the last remnants of what could be called the Garden of Eden. And so the highly sophisticated civilizations of Africa, with their vastly superior technologies of bongo drums, pointy sticks and loincloths, as well as their reputation for peaceful cuddliness towards everyone, were brought under the cruel rule of European powers in a process known as imperialism, a hitherto totally unknown concept, especially on the African continent. Modernity brought untold horrors, wreaked upon the world by white men. But at last, forced by women, and entirely against their will, men granted women the vote. That is except for those more culturally diverse parts of the world of flowing gowns, sandy dunes and calls to prayer, in which it would not be right to impose such imperialist Western standards. Amid the great wars caused by the institutionalized structural whiteness arose a great glorious revolution in the vastness of Russia. Sadly, though, it was usurped by the phallocentric patriarchy, and therefore communism, real communism that is, has never been tried. Culturally and racially diverse leaders emerged, trying to bring greater harmony to the world, especially those parts previously brutally colonised by the White Devil. Great minds such as those of Muammar Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, Mobutu Sese Seko, or the great champion of peaceful change, widely famed for having introduced new uses for refrigeration to the African continent, that was the great Idi Amin. At last, following on from the great microaggression holocaust of the first decade of the 21st century, came the Great Awakening. The postmodern age had dawned. The era of wokeness had arrived. From everywhere they rose, the feminist allies and supporters of racial justice, the glorious denizens of peaceful violence, Antifa. Diversity officers at last began to be placed everywhere, to police language, speech and behaviour, in a society which had finally realised that any other policing needed to be abolished, and that above all, causing offence needed to be understood as the highest crime against humanity, which had been the root cause for all transgressions against villainous white laws and rules all along. A new age, in which horrific mansplaining phenomena such as humour are to be exterminated, much like the last vestiges of masculinity, toxic or otherwise. And so now we gaze forward onto the sunlit uplands of a future of equity, where all leaders of everything, countries, corporations, state-run gulags and moon bases, are of colour. A world of female liberation, except for those places where they must wear the burqa. A place of free love, especially for people who haven't yet decided what sex they are. Queers and gays, whatever the difference between them in any given week may be defined as, and all those more diverse countries in which they'll continue throwing them off rooftops or beating them to death in angry mobs. A world of endless peace, except where there is just war. A world of tolerance and understanding, except on those subjects in which you ought to keep your mouth shut. A perfect world, run by the perfect people. Who they are? Well, don't worry. We will let you know. That is all from the Cyberpars for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.